Somewhere in the ancient city of Nineveh, buried beneath centuries of desert sand in what is now northern Iraq, a clay tablet was waiting. It had been waiting for roughly 2,700 years. When a young British scholar named George Smith finally brushed the dust from its surface in 1872, what he read stopped him cold. He reportedly stood up from his workbench, began pacing, and according to colleagues who witnessed the moment, started removing his clothes in a kind of stunned, involuntary disbelief. What the tablet described was a flood, a world-ending flood, a divine warning delivered to one chosen man, a massive vessel built to survive the rising waters, birds released to find dry land, a mountain where the vessel finally came to rest. George Smith was not reading the Bible. He was reading a story that was already ancient when the Bible was written. That story, carved into Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, predates the book of Genesis by at least 1,400 years. And the moment George Smith recognized what he was holding, a question entered the world that has never been fully answered. Why does this story exist twice? Why does it exist with such precise structural detail in two texts from two different cultures, separated by geography, by language, by everything that should make independent invention improbable? That question, as it turns out, is only the beginning. Because the flood story does not exist twice. It exists more than 200 times. The scholar Sir James George Fraser spent years cataloguing flood narratives from cultures across every inhabited continent and published his findings in 1919. 217 distinct traditions, separate civilizations, separate languages, separate centuries, all of them describing a world drowned, a remnant saved, and a civilization rebuilt from almost nothing. Mesopotamia, ancient India, Mesoamerica, China, the Norse world, Aboriginal Australia, West Africa, the Pacific Islands, 217 times, across cultures that had no documented contact with one another. The same story surfaces from the same silent depths of human memory. Now, some of those parallels can be explained. People living near rivers flood, coastlines change, local disasters leave local memories. That much makes sense. But when you sit with the details, not the broad strokes, not the general shape of the story, but the specific, granular, structural details, the explanation of coincidence begins to feel less comfortable. In the Gilgamesh tablet, the survivor releases a raven, then a dove. The dove returns. He waits. He releases the dove again. It does not return. Land has been found. In the book of Genesis, Noah releases a raven, then a dove. The dove returns. He waits. He releases the dove again. It does not return. Land has been found. The sequence is not similar. It is the same sequence, word for word, beat for beat, the same narrative choreography appearing in two texts that their respective traditions claim were written independently. Dr. Irving Finkel, curator of the Middle East collection at the British Museum, has spent decades studying the cuneiform flood tablets. He has noted that the linguistic structures describing these events share a degree of precision that makes independent invention, as he put it, statistically unlikely, not impossible, statistically unlikely. And it does not stop with the flood. Across these same ancient civilizations, Sumer around 3000 BCE, the Vedic culture of ancient India around 1500 BCE, the Maya civilization between 250 and 900 CE, ancient China with its Gunyu flood myth around 2300 BCE, and the Norse tradition preserved in the Prose Edda around 1220 CE. A second pattern appears, running alongside the flood, a darkness, a cold that descended and would not leave, a sun that faded or disappeared for what the ancient writers described not in days, but in seasons, in years. And a third pattern, fire, not the fire of a hearth or a battlefield, fire from above. The ancient Maya Popol Vuh describes a black resinous substance raining from the sky. The Vedic Puranas describe a cosmic fire called Samvartaka that consumes the world before each new cycle begins. The Egyptian Ippura papyrus, a document housed today at the Rijksmuseum van Oudheden in Leiden, the Netherlands, dated to around 1800 BCE, describes fire going up on high against the enemies of existence itself. Three separate catastrophic elements: flood, darkness, fire from the sky, described independently, across 5 continents, by civilizations that by every measure of the historical record had no reason to share a story. Now, before we go any further, if you have found your way to this channel, and this kind of slow, careful unfolding of buried history is what you are here for, it would mean a great deal to have you stay. Consider subscribing and turning on the notification bell, so that when the next piece of this story comes together, you will be the first to find it. This channel is built for the kind of viewer who is willing to sit with a question long enough to let it open into something larger. We are glad you are here, because what opens next is larger than the flood story, larger than any single myth. One theory, put forward by researchers including Dr. Adrian Mayer of Stanford University, working in the field known as geomythology, suggests that these are not myths at all in the dismissive sense of the word. They are not decorative fictions invented to explain the rain. They are something closer to records, compressed, encoded, carried forward through generations by the only technology available to people who had no paper, no printing press, no hard drive, the human voice, the ritual recitation, the story told at the fire until the children knew it by heart and told it to their own children, and so on for 10,000 years. What remains unexplained and what no single theory has yet resolved to everyone's satisfaction is why the encoding is so specific. Why the birds? Why the mountain? Why the darkness measured in winters rather than days? Why the fire from above described in such physical material terms by cultures that had no astronomical traditions sophisticated enough to generate the metaphor independently? 5 civilizations. No documented contact. No shared trade route we have found. No common language family. And the same catastrophe, described in the same sequence, preserved in the same bones of the same story, emerging from the ancient silence of 5 completely separate pasts. That is not a coincidence that explains itself. It is a coincidence that asks a question, and the question, once you hear it clearly, is very difficult to stop hearing, so let us follow it. All the way back to the beginning. In the summer of 1872, George Smith sat in the Egyptian and Assyrian room of the British Museum with a fragment of baked clay in his hands. The fragment was one of thousands recovered from the ruins of the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, a library that had once held more than 30,000 clay tablets before it was buried, undisturbed, beneath the collapsed debris of a civilization that fell in 612 BCE. Smith had been working through the fragments methodically, translating the ancient Akkadian cuneiform line by line, when the words on the surface of that particular tablet began to resolve into something he recognized: a man warned by a god, a coming flood, a vessel, animals taken aboard in pairs, birds sent out to find land. Smith published his findings that same year. The reaction from the scholarly world was, depending on who you ask, either fascinated or deeply uncomfortable. Because what Smith had found was not a variation on the biblical flood story. It was the flood story, written down on clay in a language that predated biblical Hebrew, in a city that had been buried for more than 2,000 years before anyone thought to look for it. The tablet he was reading, Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, was a copy of a text that scholars now date to around 2100 BCE in its earliest written form. The Genesis account, by most scholarly consensus, reached its canonical written form around 450 BCE. The gap between those two dates is roughly 1600 years. Smith had not found a parallel to Genesis. He had found its ancestor. But here is what the discovery of the Gilgamesh tablet did not explain, and still does not explain today. Why, when you pull back from the Mesopotamian tradition and look at the full global picture, the flood story appears not once, not twice, but with a frequency and a structural consistency that defies the comfortable explanations. Sir James George Fraser was a Scottish anthropologist working in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His work was meticulous, painstaking, and in some ways unfashionable by the standards of later scholarship. But the raw data he assembled in his 1919 volume, Folklore in the Old Testament, remains one of the most comprehensive catalogues of comparative mythology ever compiled. What Fraser documented was 217 distinct flood traditions drawn from cultures across every inhabited continent, each describing a great inundation, a selected survivor, and a world rebuilt from almost nothing afterward. 217. That number deserves a moment. Because when most people think about the flood story, They think about two versions, the Babylonian and the biblical. Maybe three, if they know about the Hindu tradition of Manu. But 217 means the flood story is not a regional phenomenon. It is not a Near Eastern phenomenon. It is a human phenomenon, distributed across the entire inhabited surface of the earth, carried in the oral traditions of cultures that had no documented contact with one another, and no plausible mechanism for sharing a single original story across the distances involved. Let us look at three of those traditions closely, because the details matter more than the broad shape of the story. The first is the one George Smith found. In Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a man named Utnapishtim is warned by the god Enki that the other gods have decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. He is told to build a vessel. The dimensions are given with architectural specificity. A cube, roughly 120 cubits on each side. He loads the vessel with his family, with craftsmen, with animals. The rains come, the flood covers the mountains. The dove returns because it cannot find dry land. He waits. He sends out a swallow. The swallow returns. He waits. He sends out a raven. The raven does not return. He knows the waters have receded enough that land exists. He opens the vessel and makes an offering to the gods. The second tradition comes from ancient India. In the Shatapatha Brahmana, a Sanskrit text dated by scholars to around 800 BCE, a man named Manu is washing his hands in a bowl of water when a small fish appears in the bowl and speaks to him. The fish tells Manu that a great flood is coming and instructs him to build a boat. Manu builds the boat. The flood comes and covers the world. The fish, which has grown to enormous size, tows Manu's boat safely through the rising waters until it comes to rest on a mountain in the far north, described in the text as the Mountain of the North. The waters slowly recede. Manu descends from the mountain and begins the work of repopulating a silent, emptied world. The third tradition comes from the Quiché Maya of what is now Guatemala, recorded in the Popol Vuh, a document compiled around 1550 CE, but drawing on oral traditions that predate European contact by centuries, possibly millennia. In the Popol Vuh, the creator gods send a flood to destroy a previous version of humanity that had failed to honor them properly. Wooden figures who had been given the form of humans but not genuine understanding are swept away by a rain that falls without stopping. The few who survive escape into the trees and onto the mountains. The world is wiped clean and begins again. Now, those three stories share the obvious broad strokes: a flood, a destruction, a survival, a new beginning. You could argue, and many scholars have argued, that those broad strokes reflect a universal human experience, that floods are real, that they are terrifying, that every culture living near water has witnessed inundation and built narrative around it. That argument has genuine weight. But then you look at the specific structural details, and the argument becomes harder to hold. In the Gilgamesh tradition and in the Genesis account, two texts from two supposedly separate traditions, the survivor releases birds in a specific sequence to test whether land has appeared. A raven, then a dove, then the dove again. The dove returns the first time. It does not return the second time. That specific sequence, not just birds, but that sequence, in that order, with that behavioral logic, appears in both texts with a precision that goes beyond thematic similarity. It reads like the same story, told by two people who learned it from the same source. What remains unexplained is why that level of structural precision exists between texts that their respective traditions claim were composed independently. It is not the kind of detail that generates itself spontaneously from the experience of flooding. People living near rivers do not independently invent the same sequence of bird releases to test for receding water. That detail is specific enough and shared precisely enough to suggest a common origin that has not yet been fully traced. Dr. Adrian Mayo, a research scholar at Stanford University who specializes in geomythology, the study of how oral traditions encode real geological and environmental events, has spent years examining what happens to human memory of catastrophic events over generational timescales. Her work, including her book The First Fossil Hunters, published in 2001, demonstrates that ancient oral traditions regularly preserve accurate information about real events across time spans that most people assume would erase such memories entirely. Aboriginal Australian traditions, for example, have been shown to accurately describe sea level conditions from as far back as 10,000 years ago, a finding we will return to in detail later in this documentary. The implication of Mayer's work, and of the geomythology framework more broadly, is that the 217 flood traditions documented by Fraser are not decorative fictions. They are not invented to explain where rivers come from or why the sea is salty. They are preserved memories of real events, events large enough and catastrophic enough to be encoded into the deepest layers of cultural identity and carried forward across hundreds of generations without being allowed to fade. And here is where the flood story becomes something more than a curiosity about the origins of the Bible. Because the question is not really whether ancient floods happened. Of course they did. The question is whether any single event or any cluster of events was large enough, widespread enough, and catastrophic enough to generate the same story with the same structural specificity across 217 separate cultural traditions distributed across every continent on Earth. When you frame it that way, the answer that begins to suggest itself is not comfortable. It does not fit neatly into any existing academic framework. It sits in the space between what we can prove and what the evidence keeps quietly pointing toward, like a shape in the water just beneath the surface that you can almost make out if you hold very still and look long enough. One theory suggests that the answer lies not in 217 separate local floods, but in one event, so large and so global that its memory was encoded independently, in parallel, by every human population that survived it. The evidence for that event is buried in the geological record, in the ice cores drilled from the Greenland ice sheet, in the sediment layers beneath the ruins of ancient settlements on 4 continents. It has a name, it has a date, and it lines up with the myths in ways that are very difficult to dismiss as coincidence. That is where we are going next. But before we do this, Kind of Story has a way of finding people at strange hours. Someone wide awake at 3 in the morning with the lights off. Someone drifting off on a long drive through somewhere quiet. Someone in a city on the other side of the world where it is already tomorrow. Wherever you are right now, and whatever the clock on your wall says, drop it in the comments. Not because it changes anything about what happened 12,900 years ago, but because there is something worth noticing about the fact that people in dozens of different time zones, in dozens of different languages, keep finding their way back to the same buried questions. Just like the civilizations we have been talking about. Different places, different hours, same story pulling them in. Tell us where you are. We are curious. Here is the script for part 03, Fire from the Sky. Forget the flood for a moment. Set aside the water, the vessel, the birds, the mountain. But there is a second thread woven into these ancient catastrophe accounts that receives far less attention than the flood. And in some ways, it is the stranger of the two, because water rising is something every coastal civilization has experienced. Water is a known terror. It has a logic. It moves in ways that can be anticipated, described, survived. Fire from the sky is different. Fire from the sky is not something a civilization living in the ancient world would invent as a metaphor without a reason. It is not the kind of image that emerges from the general anxiety of human existence, the way flood imagery might. When a culture encodes the memory of fire descending from above, not lightning, not the ordinary fire of storms, that changes the world beneath it, that specificity asks to be taken seriously. And the specificity, when you look at the texts closely, is the first thing that stops you. The Popol Vuh, the sacred narrative of the Quiché Maya, compiled around 1550 CE from oral traditions that stretch back far earlier, does not describe the catastrophe of a previous world age in vague or poetic terms. It describes a black resinous substance raining from the sky, not fire in the metaphorical sense, not the wrath of a god rendered as light. A physical substance, black, resinous, falling. The text was recorded by a Quiché nobleman named Diego Reynoso shortly after the Spanish conquest of Guatemala, transcribed in the Roman alphabet, from a tradition that had been carried orally through generations of ritual specialists whose entire purpose was to preserve the accuracy of what they held. The word translated as resinous refers to something thick, dark, sticky, the kind of material that burns long and hot once it is ignited. Chemists and geologists who study impact events will tell you that one of the documented byproducts of a large bolide, a comet or asteroid entering and fragmenting in the atmosphere, is the production and dispersal of a carbon-rich, tar-like material. The term used in the scientific literature is carbonaceous spherules. They fall, they burn, they leave a layer in the soil that researchers can identify thousands of years later. That connection has not been proven. But it has been noted, and it is the kind of detail that sits uncomfortably in the middle distance between coincidence and something else. Now move east. Move across the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, and into the ancient Near East, to a document that most people have never heard of, but that has been sitting in a museum in Leiden, in the Netherlands, for nearly 2 centuries. The Ipuwer papyrus, catalogued as Leiden Papyrus I 344, dated by Egyptologists to approximately 1800 BCE, is a text that reads unlike almost anything else that survives from ancient Egypt. Most Egyptian literary documents from this period are administrative, religious, or celebratory. The Ipuwer papyrus is none of those things. It is a lament, a detailed, specific, almost forensic description of a world coming apart. The text describes a sequence of disasters, water turning red and becoming undrinkable. And then, in language that the scholars who have studied it find difficult to render as purely metaphorical, fire going up on high, burning in a way that moves against the order of things. The author, a man referred to only as Ipuwer, writes not like someone constructing an allegory. He writes like someone describing what he saw. John Bimson, a researcher at Trinity College, Bristol, has argued that the Ipuwer papyrus encodes a genuine environmental catastrophe, one that matches in its sequence of disasters certain patterns we now associate with large-scale atmospheric disturbance events. That argument remains contested among Egyptologists, but the physical document exists. The Rijksmuseum van Oud-Hayden in Leiden holds it today. The words are not in dispute. What they mean is, move further east still, into the ancient Indian subcontinent, where a body of sacred literature called the Puranas, compiled in its current form between roughly 400 and 1000 CE, but drawing on oral traditions many centuries older, preserves a concept called the Samvartaka. The Samvartaka is not a god. It is not a metaphor for divine punishment. In the Bhagavata Purana, it is described as a fire that comes at the end of each world cycle and consumes everything that exists: the earth, the oceans, the sky above. The description is cosmological in scale, but what is striking is the physical language used to render it. The Samvartaka rises from below the ocean floor. It spreads across the surface of the water. It ascends. The imagery is not lightning from above. It is something that begins at the boundary between sea and sky and expands outward in all directions. One theory suggests that the Samvartaka passages preserve a distorted but structurally coherent memory of an impact event or a massive submarine volcanic episode, something that would appear to anyone witnessing it from a distance as fire erupting from the meeting point of ocean and horizon. That is speculative. The texts are ancient and the chain of transmission is long, but the physical specificity is there, and it is not the kind of specificity that tends to generate itself from pure imagination. Now go north. Go to the cold latitudes of Scandinavia, where the Norse tradition preserved in the Prose Edda, compiled around 1220 CE by the Icelandic scholar Snorri Sturluson in Reykjavik, describes the end of the world in a sequence called Ragnarok. Most people know the broad shape of Ragnarok from popular culture. What most people do not know is the specific opening condition that sets it in motion. Before the gods fall, before the wolf swallows the sun, before any of the famous final battles, there is something called Fimbulwinter, 3 consecutive winters with no summer between them. The world grows cold and dark and the crops fail, and civilization begins to fracture from the inside before anything catastrophic has even arrived from outside. And then, after the long darkness, a figure called Surtur arrives from the south carrying a sword that burns brighter than the sun and sets the world alight. Cold first, then fire. Darkness. That sequence, extended cold followed by catastrophic heat, is not an intuitive narrative structure. It does not follow from ordinary human experience of seasons or weather, but it does follow from something else. It follows from what happens in the aftermath of a large impact event or a major volcanic episode. The initial dispersal of particulate matter into the upper atmosphere blocks sunlight and causes rapid cooling. That cooling period can last months or years. And then, as the particulate settles and the atmospheric chemistry shifts, the secondary effects begin: wildfires, superheated storms, the release of stored thermal energy in patterns that would have been experienced by anyone on the ground as an incomprehensible reversal of the natural order. Cold, then fire, written down in Iceland in 1220 CE from a tradition that reaches back through Viking Age oral poetry into a past that no one has fully mapped. Archaeologists have noted that the Ipuwer papyrus, the Popol Vuh, the Samvartaka passages of the Bhagavata Purana, and the Fimbulwinter sequence of the Prose Edda share something that goes beyond thematic similarity. They share a physical grammar, a vocabulary of specific sensory details, color, texture, sequence, temperature that is consistent across texts, composed in 4 different languages, on 4 different continents, by 4 different civilizations, across a span of roughly 3,000 years of recorded history. What remains unexplained is why that physical grammar is so consistent. A metaphor invented independently in 4 places to describe the abstract idea of divine punishment does not need to specify that the falling material was black and resinous. It does not need to describe the cold arriving before the fire. It does not need to locate the source of the burning at the boundary between ocean and sky. Those details are not required by the narrative. They are not decorative. They serve no theological function. They are simply there, encoded in the oldest layers of each tradition, waiting in the silence of the texts for someone to notice that they rhyme. There is a word in geology for the physical record of a large impact event preserved in the sediment layers of the earth. It is called a boundary layer, a thin, distinct line in the rock or soil where everything above it is different from everything below it. A moment where the world changed. The ancient traditions we have been moving through tonight are, one theory suggests, the human equivalent of that boundary layer, encoded not in stone but in story, carried not in sediment but in memory, pressed thin by the weight of time, but still there, still legible. If you know what you are reading, and just below that boundary layer, buried in the geological and archaeological record of 4 continents, something is waiting to be found. Something with a date, something with physical evidence, something that lines up with the myths in ways that the mainstream conversation has been very slow to fully reckon with. That is where we are going in the next part of this story. There is a line in the geological record that scientists can point to with precision, not a metaphor, not an inference drawn from ancient texts, an actual physical line. A thin, dark stratum, preserved in sediment cores, in ice cores, in the exposed walls of archaeological excavation sites on 4 separate continents, that marks a moment approximately 12,900 years ago when something changed. When the world above that line became measurably, fundamentally different from the world below it. Below the line, a planet warming steadily out of the last ice age, megafauna grazing across North America, mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, horses, camels. The Clovis culture, one of the earliest well-documented human civilizations in the Americas, leaving their distinctive stone tools across a landscape that was beginning to open and green after millennia of cold. A world in the slow, ordinary process of becoming the world we know. Above the line, almost none of that. The warming trend reversed so abruptly that within decades, not centuries, not millennia, but decades, the planet plunged back into near glacial conditions that persisted for approximately 1,200 years. Glaciologists call this cold reversal the Younger Dryas. They named it after a small Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in European sediment records during this period, marking the return of tundra conditions to latitudes that had been warming for thousands of years. For most of the 20th century, the Younger Dryas was attributed to changes in ocean circulation. The prevailing explanation held that the rapid melting of the North American ice sheet poured enormous volumes of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, disrupting the thermohaline circulation, the deep ocean conveyor belt that distributes heat around the planet, and triggering the sudden cold snap. That explanation is not wrong. Exactly. The freshwater pulse almost certainly played a role, but it does not account for everything that the boundary layer contains. And what the boundary layer contains is the part of this story that changes everything. In 2007, a research team led by James Kennett, a geologist at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Richard Firestone, a nuclear physicist at Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, one of the most prestigious peer-reviewed journals in the world. The paper proposed what has since become known as the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. The argument, stated plainly, is this. Approximately 12,900 years ago, one or more fragments of a comet or asteroid exploded over or near the Laurentide ice sheet, the massive glacier that covered most of what is now Canada and the northern United States, triggering catastrophic wildfires across the North American continent, destabilizing the ice sheet and releasing the freshwater pulse that disrupted ocean circulation and sending a shockwave of environmental destruction across the northern hemisphere that lasted for more than a millennium. The evidence Kennett and Firestone presented was not theoretical. It was physical. It was sitting in the ground at 52 archaeological and geological sites spread across 4 continents, waiting for someone to look for it in the right way. What they found in that boundary layer, that thin dark line in the sediment at 12,900 years ago, was a suite of markers that geologists associate specifically with high-temperature cosmic impact events. Magnetic spherules, tiny, perfectly round particles of fused iron and silica that form when rock or soil is vaporized by extreme heat and then rapidly resolidified in the air. Carbonaceous spherules. The carbon-rich, tar-like particles produced when organic material is combusted at temperatures far beyond what ordinary wildfires generate. Iridium and platinum group element anomalies, concentrations of metals that are vanishingly rare in the Earth's crust, but abundant in certain classes of asteroids and comets, appearing in the boundary layer at levels far above the geological background. And then there were the nanodiamonds. Nanodiamonds are exactly what they sound like diamonds, measured not in carats or millimeters, but in nanometers, invisible to the naked eye, formed only under conditions of extreme pressure and temperature, the kind of conditions that exist inside a nuclear detonation, or at the moment of a large cosmic impact. They do not form in volcanic eruptions. They do not form in ordinary wildfires. They are not produced by any known terrestrial geological process. And they appear in the Younger Dryas boundary layer at multiple sites, including Blackwater Draw in New Mexico, one of the most significant Clovis culture excavation sites in North America, at Oman in the Netherlands, and at Abu Huraira in northern Syria. Abu Huraira is worth pausing on. Abu Huraira is a tell an archaeological mound formed by the accumulated debris of successive human settlements located in the Euphrates River Valley in what is now northern Syria. It was excavated in the 1970s by Andrew Moore of the Rochester Institute of Technology before the site was submerged beneath the Assad Reservoir. Moore's team recovered an extraordinary stratigraphic record of continuous human habitation stretching from approximately 13,500 years ago through to roughly 7,500 years ago, one of the longest unbroken records of human settlement ever documented at a single site. At the Younger Dryas boundary layer within that excavation, the layer dating to approximately 12,900 years ago, Moore's team found something that did not fit the expected pattern. The site showed evidence of sudden, intense burning at temperatures far beyond what cooking fires or structural fires would produce. They found melted building materials, they found spherules, and in subsequent analysis of the Abu Huraira samples by Kennett's team, they found nanodiamonds and platinum group element anomalies consistent with the same boundary layer signatures found at sites thousands of miles away. What remains unexplained is why the platinum anomaly layer at Abu Huraira coincides almost precisely with a dramatic change in the settlement pattern at the site. The people who had been living there, people who were, by this point in history, beginning the transition from foraging to early cultivation, one of the most consequential transitions in all of human prehistory, appear to have abandoned their way of life at almost exactly this moment. The site was not immediately deserted, but the evidence of that catastrophic burning event sits at the base of a period of significant cultural disruption that archaeologists have documented but not yet fully explained. Now here is where the scientific story becomes complicated, because the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis despite the weight of physical evidence assembled by Kennett, Firestone, and their collaborators, has not been universally accepted. Science does not work by announcement, it works by challenge and replication, and the hypothesis has received both. In 2011, a team led by Nicholas Pinter of Southern Illinois University published a critique in Earth Science Reviews, arguing that many of the impact markers, the spherules, the carbon layer, the iridium anomalies could be explained by more ordinary processes: wildfires, volcanic activity, cosmic dust that accumulates continuously in the atmosphere at low background levels. Pinter's team argued that the evidence did not meet the threshold required to confirm a single large impact event. That critique was substantive. It was peer-reviewed. It mattered, and the researchers on the other side of the argument took it seriously enough to spend the following decade expanding the dataset, refining the methodology, and publishing responses. In 2018, a large independent research team led by Wendy Woolbach of DePaul University published a two-part study in the Journal of Geology, presenting evidence of a global wildfire event at the Younger Dryas boundary, so large that it consumed an estimated approximately 10% of the terrestrial biomass of the entire planet, 10% of all plant life on Earth, burning within what the geological record suggests was a geologically instantaneous window of time. Woolbach's team argued that no known terrestrial mechanism, no combination of drought and lightning and ordinary fire dynamics could account for that scale of burning. The energy required pointed to a source outside the Earth. The debate has not ended. As recently as 2023, new studies published in scientific reports have continued to add sites, refine dates, and deepen the evidentiary picture. The hypothesis remains, in the formal language of science, contested, but the number of sites at which the boundary layer markers have now been found has grown to over 50, distributed across North America, Europe, the Middle East, and South America. The markers keep appearing, the debate keeps refining itself, and the date keeps holding steady. 12,900 years ago, give or take a few centuries, something happened, something large, something that ended the Clovis culture, killed the North American megafauna, triggered over 1,000 years of planetary cooling, and left a thin, dark line in the sediment of 50 sites across 4 continents as the only silent, patient, buried testimony to what that something was. Now, hold that date in your mind, 12,900 years ago, and then remember what we established in the earlier parts of this documentary: the flood traditions, the fire from the sky, the darkness that descended and would not lift, the strange, specific, structurally consistent catastrophe memories encoded in the ancient texts of Sumer, India, Mesoamerica, Egypt, and Scandinavia traditions that researchers like Dr. Adrian Mayer have shown are capable of preserving accurate environmental memory across timescales of exactly this length, 12,900 years ago. The Younger Dryas boundary, the platinum layer at Abu Huraira, the nanodiamonds at Blackwater Draw, the 10% global biomass burning event, and 217 flood traditions, and the black resinous substance raining from the sky in the Popol Vuh, and the fire that comes before the darkness in the Norse tradition, and the Samvataka rising from the boundary between ocean and sky in the Vedic texts. One theory suggests these are not 2 separate bodies of evidence pointing in 2 separate directions. One theory suggests they are the same event, seen from 2 different angles, one preserved in stone and ice and sediment, the other preserved in story and ritual and the carefully tended memory of civilizations that understood, at some deep level, that what had happened to the world once could happen to it again. What remains unexplained is how 2 bodies of evidence, this large, this consistent, and this convergent, have remained in separate academic conversations for this long. The geologists study the boundary layer. The mythologists study the ancient texts. The archaeologists excavate the abandoned settlements. And the question that sits at the intersection of all 3 disciplines, the question of whether the myths and the geology are describing the same morning, the same sky, the same fire, remains, for now, unanswered. But it is no longer unasked. And that, it turns out, is where the most interesting part of this story begins. There is a particular kind of fear that does not have a clean modern equivalent. We live in a world of electric light, of climate-controlled interiors, of weather forecasts delivered to a device in our pocket. We understand, at a cognitive level, that the sun will rise tomorrow, that winter ends, that the cold is temporary and the warmth returns on a schedule we can predict to the minute. Strip all of that away. Put yourself in the position of someone living 10,000 years ago, or 5,000 years ago, or even 1,500 years ago, someone whose entire understanding of time and survival is built around the reliable cycle of seasons, whose food supply depends on the sun arriving on schedule, whose cosmology is organized around the certainty that light follows darkness in a rhythm as dependable as breathing. And then imagine the sun not coming back, not for a day. A season passes, and the sky remains the color of ash. Another season passes. The crops fail. The animals move or die. The cold deepens in ways that have no precedent in living memory, or in the memory of anyone's grandparents, or in the oldest stories the elders know. The world is not ending in fire. It is ending in a slow, grey, silent erasure. A world being slowly swallowed by its own shadow. That image, that specific, terrible image of a sun that will not return, appears in the ancient catastrophe traditions with a consistency that matches the flood and the fire, and in some ways exceeds them in its emotional precision, because it is not a general image of destruction. It is a very specific description of a very specific kind of environmental collapse, and the fact that it appears, independently encoded, in traditions separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, begin in Scandinavia, in the Prose Edda, compiled by Snorri Sturluson in Reykjavik around 1220 CE, from a tradition of oral poetry that stretches back through the Viking Age into a past that predates any written record. There is a concept called Fimbulwinter. The word itself translates roughly as the Great Winter or the Mighty Winter. It is described not as a single harsh season, but as 3 consecutive winters arriving without any summer between them. 3 years of unbroken cold and darkness. The sun rises but gives no warmth. The snow falls from every direction. The world freezes from the inside out. Families turn against one another in the competition for dwindling food. Social bonds dissolve. The structures that hold civilization together, kinship, obligation, shared ritual, begin to fail under the pressure of a cold that simply will not end. Fimbulwinter is not the apocalypse in the Norse tradition. It is what comes before the apocalypse. It is the precondition. The sequence matters, not fire first, not flood first, but a prolonged extinction of warmth and light that leaves humanity weakened, fractured, and unprepared for what follows. Now move east and south, out of the cold latitudes entirely, into the ancient Iranian world. The Vendidad is one of the texts of the Avesta, the sacred scriptures of Zoroastrianism, composed in the Avestan language and dated by scholars to approximately 600 BCE in its written form, though the oral tradition it encodes is almost certainly older. In the second chapter of the Vendidad, the creator god Ahura Mazda appears to a man named Yima, the first king, the first man to rule over the living world, and delivers a warning that is specific enough and practical enough to read less like theology and more like emergency preparation. Ahura Mazda tells Yima that a fatal winter is coming, not a harsh season, a fatal one, a winter that will kill every living creature left exposed to it. He instructs Yima to build a vara, a word that translates as enclosure or fortified shelter, and to bring into it the seeds of every plant, the finest specimens of every animal, and the best of humanity, to be sealed inside and preserved through the long catastrophe that is coming. The vara is described with architectural specificity, a square of 2 hathras on each side, with streets and houses arranged within it, lit by its own internal light, because the external light will be unavailable. That architectural specificity is worth sitting with. A theological metaphor does not need precise dimensions. A poetic warning about divine punishment does not need to specify the layout of streets, or the arrangement of housing, or the provision of artificial light. Those details are the details of someone who is trying to communicate practical information, the kind of information that needs to survive transmission across generations, because the event it describes might happen again, and someone will need to know what to do What remains unexplained is why a sacred text from ancient Iran is describing an underground survival shelter with a level of practical detail that has no theological function. The detail is simply there, faded but legible, waiting in the ancient text like a set of instructions written by someone who understood that memory, without specificity, is just story. Now cross the Pacific entirely. The Chilambalam of Chumayel is a colonial-era Yucatec Maya document compiled in the town of Chumayel in what is now the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico, written in the Roman alphabet, sometime in the 17th or 18th century CE, but transcribing oral traditions whose roots reach back far beyond European contact. Among the passages describing the transition between world ages, there is a description of the era before the current creation, in which the text states, with a plainness that needs no interpretation, there was no sun, there was no moon, there were no stars. The world existed in total darkness before the current order of things was established. Again, broad strokes. You could read that as pure cosmological poetry. The darkness before creation is a nearly universal narrative device. But within the Chilambalam, the darkness is not the primordial void before creation. It is a condition that follows a destruction. The previous world age was ended, and then there was darkness. And then, after the darkness, the current world began. The sequence is not creation from nothing. It is destruction, then darkness, then renewal. That sequence is different from a creation myth. It is a catastrophe myth with a darkness interlude, and it matches, in its structural bones, what the Norse tradition describes and what the Zoroastrian tradition describes and what we are about to see the scientific record describes. Because here is where the ancient texts and the physical evidence begin to speak in the same language. In 1999, a dendrochronologist, a scientist who reads the history of the world in the growth rings of ancient trees, named Mike Bailey at Queen's University Belfast, published a book called Exodus to Arthur, in which he presented evidence from Irish oak tree ring data for a series of catastrophic environmental downturns in the historical period. Tree rings do not lie. A tree that experiences a year of warmth and adequate moisture produces a wide, healthy ring. A tree that experiences cold, drought, or sustained darkness produces a ring so narrow it is almost invisible. Bailey's Irish oak chronology, built from thousands of preserved ancient timbers, shows a series of event signatures so severe that the trees were barely growing at all during certain specific years. The most dramatic of those signatures clusters around the years 535 and 536 CE. In those years, the Irish oaks record one of the worst environmental downturns in the entire 2,000-year chronology. The rings are barely there, and the Irish oaks were not alone. Dendrochronological records from Siberia, from Scandinavia, from North America, and from South America all show the same catastrophic narrowing at the same moment. A global signature, a single event, or closely clustered events that affected tree growth simultaneously across the entire planet. Ice core data from the GISP-2 core drilled by the National Science Foundation from the Greenland ice sheet confirms a massive volcanic or atmospheric event at approximately this same period. A layer of sulfuric acid and particulate matter deposited in the ice that is consistent with either a very large volcanic eruption or a cluster of eruptions releasing enough material into the upper atmosphere to partially block sunlight across the globe for a period of months or years. The historian and archaeologist David Keyes documented the historical consequences of this event in his 2000 book Catastrophe, tracing the 6th century CE collapse of multiple civilizations, the weakening of the Eastern Roman Empire, the collapse of the Teotihuacan civilization in Mexico, the disruption of Sassanid Persia, the transformation of plague dynamics in Europe to this single environmental trigger, a few years of reduced sunlight, a few years of failed harvests, and the dominoes of interconnected civilization begin to fall in sequence. Now here is the critical bridge. The 535 CE event, a historically recent, archaeologically documented, dendrochronologically confirmed episode of years without adequate sun, produced consequences so severe that it reshaped the political and demographic map of the entire ancient world. And that event, large as it was almost certainly smaller than what happened at the Younger Dryas boundary 12,900 years ago. Smaller than what happened when whatever fragmented over the Laurentide ice sheet sent its debris across the northern hemisphere and left platinum and nanodiamonds in the soil of Syria and New Mexico and the Netherlands. If a moderate volcanic winter in 535 CE was enough to collapse empires, trigger migrations, and rewrite the political history of 3 continents, what would an event 10 times larger, or 100 times larger, have looked like to the people who survived it? It would have looked like 3 winters with no summer between them. It would have looked like a sky that gave no warmth. It would have looked like the sun fading slowly behind a veil that never fully lifted. It would have looked, to the people who encoded it into the deepest layers of their sacred traditions and carried it forward through the long silence of 10,000 years of human memory, exactly like what they described: a great winter, a darkness that lasted, a world holding its breath in the cold, waiting for a light that was very slow in returning. And when the light finally came back, when the ash settled and the sky cleared and the world began again, and encoded what they had survived into stories precise enough to last forever. Which raises a question that we have been circling around since the beginning of this documentary and have not yet directly addressed. Who were those people? Where did they come from? And why? In so many of the traditions that describe the world rebuilt after catastrophe, do the survivors not rebuild it alone? That is where we are going next. At some point while moving through this documentary, a reasonable person will have raised a reasonable objection. It may have arrived quietly, somewhere in the back of the mind, while we were tracing flood narratives across continents or following the darkness motif through Norse and Zoroastrian and Maya traditions. The objection sounds something like this: these stories are old, very old, and old stories change. They get embellished, compressed, reinterpreted by every generation that passes them forward. A story that has traveled through 500 generations of human mouths is not the same story that entered the first mouth. How much of what we are reading in these ancient texts is genuine, preserved memory, and how much is the accumulated distortion of thousands of years of retelling? It is a fair question. It is, in fact, the central methodological question of the entire field of geomythology. And the answer, when you look at what the research actually shows, is considerably more surprising than most people expect. In 2015, Dr. Patrick Nunn, a geographer and ocean scientist at the University of the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia, began collaborating with linguist Dr. Nicholas Reed of the University of New England on a project that would take several years to complete and would, when it was finally published in the Journal of Geological Research in 2016, quietly shift the boundaries of what mainstream science considered possible for oral tradition. What Nunn and Reed did was systematic. They identified 21 distinct Aboriginal Australian oral traditions, stories told by different language groups across the Australian continent, from communities with no documented contact with one another, that described the same kind of event, a time when the sea was lower than it is today, when land that is now underwater was dry and habitable, when the coastline looked fundamentally different from how it looks now. These were not vague stories about water, they were specific. They named places. They described geographical features, bays, headlands, islands, river mouths, that matched the submerged landscape in ways that could be tested against the geological record of post-glacial sea level rise. And when Nunn and Reed tested them, the stories held. The geological record of sea level change around the Australian coastline is well established. After the last glacial maximum, global sea levels rose approximately 120 meters over a period of roughly 10,000 years, inundating vast areas of the continental shelf and producing the coastline that exists today. That process was not uniform. It happened in pulses, with periods of rapid rise interspersed with relative stability, and the timing of those pulses varied by region. The geological data is precise enough that researchers can say, for a given location on the Australian coast, approximately when specific pieces of land were submerged beneath the rising sea. When Nunn and Reed mapped the Aboriginal traditions against that geological timeline, they found that the stories were describing real inundation events that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago, not approximately, not in the general range. With a degree of geographical and chronological specificity, that required the oral traditions to have been preserving accurate environmental information for a minimum of 7,000 years, and in some cases for as long as 12,000 years. 12,000 years of accurate memory, carried not in writing, not in stone inscription, not in any medium that we would normally associate with reliable information storage, but in the human voice, in ritual performance, in the structured recitation of trained specialists, whose social function within their communities was precisely this: to hold the story exactly, to pass it forward without distortion, to treat the accuracy of what they carried as a matter of survival rather than entertainment. Archaeologists have noted that Aboriginal traditions describing land now beneath the sea have been corroborated at specific locations, including Spencer Gulf in South Australia, where the submerged landscape matches the geographical features described in local oral traditions with a precision that independent invention cannot plausibly explain. And Port Phillip Bay in Victoria, where underwater archaeological surveys have identified submerged stone arrangements consistent with human activity from the period when that land was above sea level. The implications of the Nunn and Reid findings extend well beyond Australia. If oral tradition is capable of preserving accurate environmental information across 12,000 years in one culture, the mechanism that makes that preservation possible is not unique to Aboriginal Australians. It is a human capacity. It is available to any culture that develops the social structures and transmission practices necessary to maintain it. And here is where the picture becomes genuinely interesting. Because when you look at the cultures that produce the most structurally precise ancient catastrophe traditions, the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the bardic traditions of West Africa, the skaldic tradition of Scandinavia, the priestly traditions of Mesoamerica, what you find, without exception, is exactly those social structures: specialized memory-keeping castes, ritual recitation practices, formalized transmission ceremonies in which accuracy is enforced by communal oversight, penalties, in some traditions, for deviation from the received text. The entire social architecture of a civilization organized at its deepest level around the project of not forgetting. In the Vedic tradition, the Brahmin reciters of ancient India developed a system of oral preservation so rigorous that it has no parallel in any other known tradition. The Rig Veda, a collection of 1,028 hymns composed in an archaic form of Sanskrit, was transmitted orally for approximately 1,500 years before it was committed to writing, and the oral tradition continued alongside the written tradition for centuries after that. The transmission method involved not merely memorization, but a series of cross-checking recitation patterns in which the text was chanted forward, backward, in alternating pairs, in a dozen other structured permutations designed to catch and correct any deviation before it could propagate. The result is a text whose oral and written versions match with a fidelity that has astonished every philologist who has studied the transmission history. One theory suggests that this level of transmission precision was not developed for its own sake. It was developed because the people who built it understood that what they were carrying was too important to allow to blur. The catastrophe memory encoded in the Vedic Puranas, the floods, the fire, the darkness, the world ages, was not decorative mythology placed at the edges of the tradition. It was central. It was foundational. It was the reason the tradition existed in the form it did. The same logic applies to the West African griot tradition, where hereditary oral historians carry the genealogical and historical memory of entire peoples across generations, measured not in decades but in centuries. It applies to the Hawaiian hula tradition, where specific movements encode specific information about navigation, genealogy, and environmental history, in a form that survives the loss of any single practitioner. It applies to the skaldic poets of Scandinavia, whose complex metrical forms, intricate interlocking patterns of syllable stress, alliteration, and internal rhyme functioned as a built-in error correction system, because a line of skaldic verse that has been altered in transmission will often fail to scan correctly, flagging the corruption for anyone trained to hear it. These are not primitive information storage systems. They are sophisticated, deliberately engineered technologies of memory, built by people who understood the problem they were solving and designed their solutions with a precision that we are only beginning to fully appreciate. What remains unexplained is a question that sits at the edge of everything the Nunn and Reid findings imply. If oral tradition is capable of preserving accurate information across 12,000 years across the precise window of time that separates us from the Younger Dryas boundary, from the platinum layer at Abu Huraira, from the nano-diamond signatures at Blackwater Draw. Then the ancient catastrophe traditions we have been examining in this documentary are not necessarily degraded copies of a real memory. They may be something much closer to the original, not myth in the dismissive sense, not allegory, not the poetic elaboration of a vague ancestral anxiety, but the carefully tended, precisely transmitted, deliberately preserved memory of a morning that the people who experienced it understood with absolute clarity that their descendants could never be allowed to forget. The flood, the fire from the sky, the years without sun carried forward in the dark, from mouth to ear, across 10,000 years of human nights, by people whose names we will never know, performing a function whose importance they understood, and we are only now beginning to recover. If that is what the oral traditions are, if they are genuine, preserved memory rather than elaborated fiction, then the next question is the one that has been waiting quietly at the back of this documentary since the very first to frame. Who carried them? Who were the people that the ancient world, across culture after culture after culture, remembered not as ordinary survivors, but as something else entirely, as teachers, as builders, as figures who arrived from the water after the catastrophe and handed civilization to the people they found waiting on the shore? That is the question we are walking into next. And it is the one that, once you look at it directly, is the hardest to walk away from. Every catastrophe story we have examined so far has a structure. A world exists. The world is destroyed. A remnant survives. And then, and this is the part that most retellings quietly skip over, civilization does not slowly rebuild itself from the ground up over thousands of years the way the standard archaeological model would predict. Instead, in tradition after tradition after tradition, it arrives, fully formed, delivered by a stranger who appears from the water, teaches everything that needs to be known, and then disappears. That pattern is so widespread and so consistent in its specific details that it deserves to be examined not as mythology, but as data. Not as a story people told because it was comforting, but as a pattern that keeps surfacing because something underneath it is real. Start in ancient Mesopotamia. Around 280 BCE, a Babylonian priest named Berossus wrote a history of his civilization in Greek for an audience of Hellenistic scholars. The original text is lost, but substantial fragments were preserved by later writers, including Eusebius of Caesarea, and those fragments contain one of the oldest and strangest accounts of cultural origin in the ancient world. Berossus describes a creature called Oannes, who appeared in the Persian Gulf in the time before recorded history. The description is specific and deliberately strange. The body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head, another head that was human, and human feet emerging beneath the fish's tail. A being that existed at the boundary between two worlds, water and land, animal and human, the before time and the historical present. Oannes, according to Berossus, emerged from the sea each day and spent the daylight hours among the people of ancient Mesopotamia. And what Oannes did during those hours was not miraculous in the supernatural sense. It was educational in the most practical sense. He taught them writing. He taught them mathematics. He taught them agriculture, how to prepare soil, how to manage water for irrigation, how to select and store seed grain across seasons. He taught them the principles of law and the organization of government. He taught them, in the compressed language of the ancient account, everything necessary for civilization to function. And at the end of each day, Oannes returned to the sea. He came from the water, he gave knowledge. He returned to the water, and Mesopotamian civilization, according to this account, was built on what he left behind. The question that Berossus does not answer the question that the fragment cannot answer, because the fuller context is lost, is where Oannes came from. What was on the other side of that water? What civilization had produced a being capable of delivering, fully formed, the entire technical and organizational foundation of one of the ancient world's great civilizations? Now move 12,000 kilometers to the west, to the high plateau of the Andes, at an elevation of approximately 3,800 meters above sea level, where the largest high-altitude lake in the world sits in the border region between what is now Peru and Bolivia. Lake Titicaca. On its shores and on the islands within it, some of the most ancient sacred traditions of the Inca civilization were centered. And at the heart of those traditions is a figure whose description, when you read it carefully, produces the same quiet discomfort as the Oannes account. His name was Viracocha. In the Inca traditions recorded by Spanish chroniclers in the 16th century CE, drawing on oral histories that the Inca themselves said stretched back to a time before memory, Viracocha appeared at Lake Titicaca after a great catastrophe in which the previous world had been destroyed. He was described as tall. He was described as having a beard significant because the indigenous populations of the Andes do not typically develop heavy facial hair, and the detail of the beard appears consistently across multiple independent accounts as something that marked Viracocha as physically anomalous, as someone who did not look like the people he taught. He wore long white robes. He traveled on foot across the Andes, healing the sick, teaching agriculture and architecture, organizing communities, and at each place he stopped, leaving behind a more functional, more organized, more technically capable human settlement than he had found. And then he reached the Pacific coast and walked into the ocean and did not return. The site of Tiwanaku, on the southern shore of Lake Titicaca, in what is now Bolivia, dated by archaeologists to between approximately 300 and 1150 CE in its major construction phases, is associated in Inca tradition with Viracocha's origin point. The monumental stone architecture at Tiwanaku, including the Gateway of the Sun, carved from a single piece of andesite weighing approximately 10 tons, represents a level of technical and organizational sophistication that still generates active academic debate about how it was achieved by the population that built it. What remains unexplained is why the Inca, who built one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the pre-Columbian Americas, entirely through their own demonstrated ingenuity, consistently attributed the foundational knowledge of their civilization not to their own ancestors, but to a bearded stranger who arrived after a catastrophe and left before history properly began. Now go north, into the Valley of Mexico, where the city of Teotihuacan sits approximately 50 kilometers northeast of what is now Mexico City, a city so ancient that when the Aztec arrived in the region in the 13th century CE, Teotihuacan had already been abandoned for 600 years, and the Aztec had no memory of who built it. They named it themselves, Teotihuacan, the place where men become gods. The Pyramid of the Sun at Teotihuacan, constructed between approximately 100 BCE and 200 CE, is the third largest pyramid in the world by volume. Its base measurements are within 1% of the base measurements of the Great Pyramid of Giza. One theory suggests that alignment is coincidental. Another theory suggests it reflects a shared technical standard derived from a common source. Neither theory has been proven. Both deserve the honest acknowledgement that the alignment exists and has not been fully explained. The deity most closely associated with the foundation of Teotihuacan and with the origin of Aztec and Toltec civilization is Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent, a figure who appears in the sacred traditions of multiple Mesoamerican cultures across a span of more than 2,000 years. The consistent description of Quetzalcoatl across those traditions is specific in the same way that Viracocha's description is specific. He was light-skinned. He was bearded. He brought knowledge of agriculture, of calendar systems, of writing, of the organization of civic life. He opposed human sacrifice. He taught a more ordered, more technically sophisticated way of living. And then, in every version of the tradition, he departed. He sailed east across the ocean on a raft of serpents, promising to return. The physical description of Quetzalcoatl, light-skinned, bearded, arriving from across the water, departing across the water, is so anomalous in the Mesoamerican context that when the Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés arrived on the eastern coast of Mexico in 1519 CE, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma II initially received him as the returning Quetzalcoatl. That identification was catastrophically wrong in its practical consequences, but it speaks to how deeply the memory of that original bearded stranger from across the sea had been encoded into the foundational identity of Mesoamerican civilization, encoded deeply enough that more than 1,000 years after this tradition began, It shaped the political response of an emperor to an invading army. Now step back from the individual accounts and look at the pattern as a whole. Oannes in Mesopotamia, Viracocha in the Andes, Quetzalcoatl in Mesoamerica, and beyond these three Thoth in ancient Egypt, credited with bringing writing and knowledge to the Nile civilization. Fuxi in ancient China, described in the oldest texts as a civilizing figure who taught agriculture, writing, and law, each arriving at the foundation moment of their respective civilization, each physically anomalous in the context of the population they taught, each departing across water, each leaving behind the complete technical and organizational infrastructure of a functioning civilization. One theory suggests these figures represent real culture bearers, survivors or representatives of a pre-catastrophe civilization, sophisticated enough to have developed writing, mathematics, agriculture, and monumental architecture before the Younger Dryas boundary event, who distributed their knowledge to the populations they encountered in the devastated aftermath. That theory is speculative. It has not been confirmed by any direct archaeological evidence. The civilization it implies advanced enough to have produced these teachers, destroyed thoroughly enough to have left almost no physical trace, would require a complete rewriting of the current model of human prehistory. But here is the problem with dismissing the theory too quickly. The pattern it would explain is real. The accounts are real. The physical descriptions are consistent across traditions that had no documented contact, and the foundational knowledge that these figures are credited with delivering writing, mathematics, agriculture, monumental architecture, legal organization appears in the civilizations they are associated with at a level of sophistication that the standard gradual development model has always struggled to fully account for. What remains unexplained is not any single account taken individually. Each one, in isolation, can be attributed to mythology, to symbolic narrative, to the universal human tendency to personify cultural origins in a founding hero figure. What remains unexplained is the aggregate, the consistency, the physical specificity, the water, the beard, the knowledge, the departure, the promise to return, repeated, independently, across every ocean, in every ancient civilization, in the silent aftermath of the same catastrophe. That is not a story someone invented. That is a description of something someone saw. And the civilization those strangers came from, wherever it was, whatever it built, whatever it knew before, the fire and the flood and the years without sun erased it from the surface of the earth, is the buried question at the center of everything we have been building toward in this documentary. We are not done looking for it. There is a hill in southeastern Turkey, roughly 15 kilometers northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa, that sits at an elevation of about 750 meters above sea level. From a distance it looks unremarkable, a rounded limestone ridge rising gently above the surrounding plain, covered in thin soil and sparse vegetation, the kind of landscape that has existed in this part of the world for as long as anyone can remember. Local farmers had been plowing around the hill for decades. A survey team from the University of Chicago passed through the area in 1963 and noted the presence of flint flakes on the surface, the kind of lithic scatter that appears around ancient human activity, but did not excavate. The hill was catalogued and forgotten. In 1994, a Kurdish shepherd noticed something protruding from the soil near the crest of the ridge. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt, working for the German Archaeological Institute, came to look. Schmidt put his hand on the surface of what the shepherd had found and immediately understood that it was not a gravestone, not a boundary marker, not any of the ordinary things that protrude from Turkish hillsides. It was the top of a shaped limestone pillar worked by human hands, of a size and sophistication that had no business being in this location. Schmidt began excavating. He would continue excavating until his death in 2014, and what emerged from beneath that unremarkable hill over those 20 years permanently disrupted the timeline of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe, the name means pot-bellied hill in Turkish, is a complex of circular stone enclosures arranged across the crest and upper slopes of the ridge. Each enclosure consists of a ring of T-shaped limestone pillars, ranging in height from around 1.5 meters to 5.5 meters. with some individual pillars weighing in the vicinity of 15 to 20 tons. The pillars are not rough-hewn. They are shaped. They taper precisely from a broad horizontal cap, the top of the T, down to a narrowing shaft that was set into prepared bedrock sockets. Many of them are carved with high-relief animal imagery. Lions, an entire menagerie, rendered with an artistic fluency that implies not the tentative scratching of an emerging tradition, but the confident hand of a fully developed craft. The date of construction, established through radiocarbon dating of organic material found in the fill associated with the oldest enclosures, is approximately 11,600 years ago. That is not a misprint. 11,600 years before the present, which places the construction of Göbekli Tepe at roughly 9600 BCE. To understand why that date is so disruptive, consider what the standard archaeological timeline holds about that period. 11,600 years ago, human beings in this part of the world were hunter-gatherers. They had not yet developed agriculture. They had not yet built permanent settlements. They had not yet developed the social organization, the division of labor, the surplus food production, or the institutional coordination that every prior model of human development held to be the necessary preconditions for monumental architecture. The Pyramid of Giza would not be built for another 7,000 years. Stonehenge would not be built for another 6,000 years. The earliest cities of Mesopotamia would not emerge for another 5,000 years. And yet here, at the very edge of the period we call prehistory, someone quarried limestone blocks weighing up to 20 tons, transported them to a hilltop, shaped them with tools we have not fully identified, set them precisely into prepared sockets, and carved them with imagery complex enough to suggest a rich, symbolic, and possibly cosmological tradition that had been developing for a very long time before it produced this. The question that Göbekli Tepe forces onto the table is not simply who built it. It is what kind of society builds something like this. Moving a 15-ton limestone pillar from a quarry several hundred meters away, the quarry has been identified. There are unfinished pillars still lying in it, requires ropes, levers, sledges or rollers, and coordinated human labor on a scale that implies not a small band of mobile foragers, but a stable, organized, well-fed population with a leadership structure capable of directing sustained, collective effort toward a single, non-subsistence goal. Archaeologists have noted that the site shows no evidence of permanent habitation. No hearths arranged for domestic cooking. No storage pits for grain. No, the kind of debris that accumulates around a place where people live. Göbekli Tepe was not a settlement. It was a destination. People came here, did something here, and left, which means the population that built it was large enough and organized enough to support a major construction project at a site that was not their home, which in turn implies a surrounding network of communities capable of collectively resourcing an endeavor of this scale. None of that should exist at this date. By every prior model of human development, the social infrastructure required to build Göbekli Tepe did not yet exist 11,600 years ago, and yet the site is there. The dates are confirmed. The pillars are real. Now consider Pillar 43. Among the many carved pillars at Göbekli Tepe, Pillar 43 inches enclosure D has attracted particular attention. It is sometimes called the vulture stone, for the large vulture carved in high relief near its center. But the imagery on Pillar 43 is not simply decorative. It is dense with symbols: a headless human figure, a scorpion, a series of circular forms arranged in a composition that appears to encode something beyond artistic expression. In 2017, Martin Sweatman, a physicist at the University of Edinburgh, and Dimitrios Tsikritsis published a paper in the journal Mediterranean Archaeology and Archaeometry, proposing that the imagery on Pillar 43 encodes an astronomical event using a star map that the arrangement of symbols corresponds to, the positions of constellations, and the date of a specific cosmic event, which their analysis placed at approximately 10,950 BCE. That date falls very close to the Younger Dryas boundary, very close to the moment when, according to the physical evidence we examined in Part 4, something fragmented over the northern hemisphere and left its signature in the sediment of 4 continents. One theory suggests that Pillar 43 is not decorative, that the people who built Göbekli Tepe were encoding, in stone, the memory of the catastrophe that preceded them, preserving in carved limestone what the oral traditions preserved in story, ensuring that the event would not be forgotten, even if the words failed. That interpretation is contested. Other archaeologists read the pillar imagery differently. The debate is ongoing and unresolved, but the convergence of the proposed date with the Younger Dryas boundary has not been dismissed, and it has not gone away. And then there is the burial. Around 8000 BCE, approximately 1600 years after the oldest enclosures were built, Göbekli Tepe was deliberately filled in, not abandoned, not left to the slow accumulation of wind-blown sediment. Filled. The enclosures were backfilled with rubble, flint flakes, and animal bones. The debris of occupation packed deliberately into the spaces between and around the pillars, burying them completely and preserving them, as it turned out, almost perfectly. Archaeologists have noted that this deliberate burial has no agreed explanation. The site was not buried because it was no longer important. The effort required to fill those enclosures with rubble suggests the opposite, that it was important enough to devote significant labor to its intentional concealment. It was not buried to protect it from enemies, because the fill is not defensive architecture. It was not buried as the result of a natural event, because the fill is too structured, too deliberate, too carefully packed to be anything other than an intentional act. What remains unexplained is why. Why would the people who built one of the most significant ritual complexes in the ancient world choose to bury it? What did they understand about what they were preserving? And why did preservation require concealment? What were they protecting it from, or protecting others from, or protecting it for? Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, who has led excavations at the site since Schmidt's death, has estimated that the excavated portions of Göbekli Tepe represent perhaps 5% of the total complex. 95% of the site remains beneath the hill, undisturbed, waiting. The German Archaeological Institute and the Turkish Ministry of Culture continue to fund excavations, and each season produces new enclosures, new pillars, new carvings that deepen the picture rather than simplifying it. The hill is still giving up its secrets slowly, and each thing it gives up makes the question larger rather than smaller, because Göbekli Tepe does not fit. It does not fit the timeline. It does not fit the social model. It does not fit the expected trajectory of a species that is supposed to have invented monumental architecture, gradually, incrementally, building up from simple structures to complex ones over thousands of years of slow development. Göbekli Tepe appears at the beginning of the record fully formed, technically sophisticated, cosmologically complex, and then gets buried by the people who built it for reasons that have been silent for more than 10,000 years. And it sits in the landscape of southeastern Turkey, approximately 500 kilometers from the ruins of ancient Nineveh, where George Smith found the flood tablet in 1872, the same region, the same ancient silence, the same buried layer waiting beneath the ordinary surface of the world. That is not coincidence. That is geography pointing at something, something that connects the monument that should not exist to the stories that should not be so consistent, to the geological boundary that should not be so precisely dated, to the strangers who should not have appeared in so many separate traditions, delivering the same knowledge from the same direction. The thread is pulling tighter, and the next place it leads is one that most official accounts have been very reluctant to follow. Let us be precise about what we are and are not claiming in this part of the documentary. We are not claiming that a secret group of powerful people meets in a windowless room and decides which archaeological discoveries the public is allowed to know about. We are not claiming that evidence is being destroyed, that researchers are being silenced at gunpoint, or that the true history of humanity is locked in a vault somewhere beneath a government building. Those claims make for compelling fiction. They are not what the evidence supports. What the evidence does support is something considerably less dramatic and considerably more interesting. It supports the existence of institutional structures, funding dependencies, career incentives, paradigm investments, professional social dynamics that systematically slow the acceptance of ideas that challenge established models, regardless of the quality of the evidence behind those ideas. That is not a conspiracy. It is how large human institutions behave. It has happened before in the history of science, It is documented, and it is happening now in the specific fields we have been examining throughout this documentary. The distinction matters because the conspiratorial framing, however emotionally satisfying, actually obscures the real and verifiable phenomenon. The real phenomenon is more mundane and more pervasive than any conspiracy, and understanding it requires looking at specific cases where the institutional resistance is documented, where the evidence was solid, and where the delay in acceptance had consequences. Begin with the Sphinx. In 1991, a geologist named Robert Schoch, an associate professor at Boston University, stood at the base of the Great Sphinx at Giza and looked at the erosion patterns on its body. Schoch was not an alternative researcher or a popular writer. He was a credentialed geologist with a specialization in stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and how they form over time. What he saw on the surface of the Sphinx enclosure was not the pattern of wind and sand erosion that dominates the surrounding monuments. It was the pattern of precipitation-induced weathering, deep, rounded, vertical channels in the limestone, the kind of profile that forms when heavy rainfall runs down a vertical surface over an extended period of time. The problem is that the Giza Plateau has not received that kind of rainfall since approximately 5000 BCE at the latest. The region became hyperarid long before the Sphinx was supposed to have been built. If the erosion patterns Schoch identified are genuinely the result of heavy rainfall, then the Sphinx, or at least the body of the Sphinx, which Schoch was careful to distinguish from the head, which may have been recarved later, was constructed before the climate of the region dried out. Before 5000 BCE, potentially long before, Schoch presented his findings at the annual meeting of the Geological Society of America in 1991. His geological peers, by and large, Zahi Hawass, then Secretary-General of the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities and the most publicly prominent Egyptologist in the world, dismissed the hypothesis forcefully and repeatedly in public statements, arguing that the geological evidence was irrelevant because no civilization capable of building the Sphinx existed before the 4th dynasty of ancient Egypt. That argument has a circularity to it that several researchers have pointed out. The conclusion no advanced pre-dynastic civilization existed is being used as evidence against data that might imply an advanced pre-dynastic civilization existed. The geological observation is not being refuted on geological grounds. It is being refuted on the grounds that it contradicts the established model, and the established model is being defended not because the geological evidence against it has been conclusively addressed, but because the professional and institutional investment in that model is substantial and the cost of revising it would be enormous. Schoch's hypothesis remains controversial. It has not been proven, but it has also not been geologically refuted. It has been institutionally resisted, which is a different thing, and the resistance has been effective enough that most introductory archaeology courses do not mention it. Now consider a case where the institutional resistance was eventually overcome by satellite data. For decades, scholars studying the Rig Veda, the oldest of the 4 Vedas, containing 1028 hymns composed in archaic Sanskrit and dated to approximately 1500 to 1200 BCE, noted that the text described a great river called the Sarasvati in terms that were unmistakably geographical. The hymns called it a river flowing from the mountains to the sea, described it as the greatest of rivers, the most mighty, and located it between the Yamuna and the Sutlej rivers in what is now northwestern India and Pakistan. The problem was that no such river exists in that location today. Mainstream scholarship, for most of the 19th and 20th centuries, classified the Sarasvati as mythological, a sacred river of the imagination, a poetic metaphor for divine abundance, the kind of geographical fiction that ancient traditions occasionally produce. The Rig Veda, on this reading, was describing a river that never existed as a physical fact. In the 1990s, satellite imagery from the Indian Space Research Organization and from the Landsat program began revealing something in the landscape of northwestern India and Pakistan that the ground-level view had obscured. Beneath the surface of the Thar Desert, running precisely through the corridor the Rig Veda described, there was a dried riverbed, enormous, wide enough and deep enough to have been. When it was active, one of the largest rivers on the Indian subcontinent, the bed ran from the Himalayan foothills to the Rann of Kutch on the Arabian Sea coast, from the mountains to the sea. exactly as the Vedic hymns described. The river is now identified as the Ghaggar-Hakra system, and the archaeological surveys of its former banks have revealed hundreds of sites belonging to the Indus Valley civilization, including some of the largest urban centers yet found. The Sarasvati was not mythological. It was geographical. The oral tradition had been accurately describing a real river for 3,000 years after that river dried up, and the scholarly consensus that dismissed it as fiction was wrong. The satellite data did not argue with the consensus. It simply showed what was in the ground, and the consensus had to revise itself. One theory suggests that these two cases, the Sphinx water erosion hypothesis and the Sarasvati River, are not isolated anomalies. They are representative examples of a broader pattern in which ancient traditions and anomalous physical evidence are systematically underweighted by institutional archaeology because the cost of taking them seriously is too high. The cost is not financial, primarily, it is paradigmatic. If the Sphinx was built before 5000 BCE, the entire timeline of Egyptian civilization requires revision. If the Sarasvati was real, the oral traditions of ancient India are more reliable historical sources than the consensus treated them as being. Each revision pulls on threads that run through the entire fabric of the established model. And the established model is what careers are built on, what textbooks are written around, what funding applications are evaluated against. Archaeologists have noted, including researchers sympathetic to the mainstream model, that the peer review system, while essential to scientific integrity, also has a conservatism built into it by design. Reviewers are experts in established frameworks. Genuinely revolutionary findings are evaluated by people whose expertise was developed within the paradigm those findings challenge. That is not corruption. It is a structural feature of how knowledge institutions work, and it produces predictable outcomes. Ideas that fit the existing framework move quickly, and ideas that challenge it move slowly, regardless of their evidentiary merit. This pattern is not unique to archaeology. The history of plate tectonics is a documented case study in how a correct geological theory, continental drift, proposed by Alfred Wegener beginning in 1912, was institutionally rejected for decades, not because the evidence was weak, but because it contradicted the established model, and its primary advocate was considered an outsider. The field, the germ theory of disease, faced similar resistance before it was accepted. In both cases, the resistance was not conspiracy. It was institutional inertia, professional tribalism, and the entirely human tendency to protect a worldview that has been expensive to build. What remains unexplained is not why institutions behave this way. That part is well understood and extensively documented. What remains unexplained is what is still waiting in the ground, in the unexcavated 95% of Göbekli Tepe, in the submerged coastal shelves of every continent, in the sites that have not yet been found, or have been found and not yet fully analyzed, that the current model has not yet been forced to reckon with. The evidence we have examined in this documentary has accumulated slowly, from the margins of multiple disciplines, against significant institutional resistance, and it keeps pointing in the same direction, toward a horizon that is older than the timeline allows, toward a chapter of human history that is buried not in a vault, not by conspiracy, but by the simple weight of time and the understandable human reluctance to revise a story that took 2 centuries of hard work to build. The story, it turns out, may need revising anyway. Everything we have examined so far in this documentary has been building toward a single observation. Not a theory, not a speculation, an observation about what the ancient world believed, consistently and independently, about the nature of time itself. We have traced the flood. We have traced the fire from the sky. We have traced the years without sun. We have followed the civilizing strangers who arrived after the catastrophe and handed knowledge to the people they found waiting on the shore. We have looked at the geological record and found a boundary layer that matches the myths with uncomfortable precision. We have looked at institutional resistance and found a pattern that explains why these convergences have remained in separate academic conversations for so long. But there is one more layer, the deepest layer, and it changes the character of the entire picture, because the ancient civilizations we have been examining did not believe the catastrophe happened once. They believed it happened before. They believed it would happen again. And they built their entire cosmological architecture around that belief, not as a source of despair, but as a framework for understanding where humanity stood in a cycle so large that any single civilization occupied only a small fraction of its total span. The world has ended before. It will end again. We are somewhere in the middle of a sequence that began long before recorded history, and will continue long after the civilization that is currently recording history has been forgotten. That is not the worldview of people who invented apocalypse stories from nothing. That is the worldview of people who had evidence. Begin in ancient India. The Puranic cosmological system, preserved in texts including the Vishnu Purana and the Bhagavata Purana, compiled in their current written form between approximately 400 and 1000 CE, but drawing on oral traditions that stretch back through the Vedic period into a past that defies precise dating, describes time not as a line, moving from creation toward a single final end, but as a wheel, a vast, rotating cycle of world ages called yugas, nested within larger cycles called manvantaras, nested within still larger cycles called kalpas, each level of the structure encoding a different timescale of cosmic change. The four yugas, Satya, Treta, Dvapara, and Kali, describe a progressive deterioration of the world across a combined cycle of approximately 4,320,000 years. In the Satya Yuga, the world is perfect, consciousness is clear, lifespan is vast, and the knowledge of the true nature of reality is universally available. As the cycle progresses through Treta and Dvapara, knowledge fades, lifespan shortens, and the quality of civilization declines. In the Kali Yuga, the current age, which the Puranic texts say began approximately 5,100 years ago, knowledge is fragmentary, lifespan is brief, and civilization is characterized by conflict, materialism, and the gradual forgetting of deeper truths. At the end of the Kali Yuga, a catastrophe resets the cycle, and the Satya Yuga begins again. The Puranic texts are explicit that this has happened before. Not once, not twice. The Vishnu Purana describes 71 manvantaras, each containing its own set of 4 yugas within a single kalpa, and describes a virtually unlimited number of kalpas preceding the current one. The universe, in this cosmological framework, is not thousands of years old, or even millions of years old. And in every cycle, civilization rises, reaches a peak, deteriorates, is destroyed, and begins again from a remnant that carries the seeds of the next iteration forward through the catastrophe. Now cross the Pacific to the Valley of Mexico. In the sacred traditions of the Aztec civilization, preserved most completely in a colonial-era Nahuatl document called the Leyenda de los Soles, compiled approximately 1558 CE, but encoding traditions that predate European contact, the history of the world is organized around the concept of 5 suns. Each sun is a complete world age, with its own creation, its own humanity, its own civilization, and its own catastrophic destruction. The current world, the 5th sun, the one we inhabit, is not the first attempt. It is the 5th, and each of the first 4 was ended by a different catastrophe. The first sun, called 4 Jaguar, was inhabited by a race of giants, and was destroyed when jaguars devoured the sun and plunged the world into darkness. The second sun, called 4 Wind, was destroyed by catastrophic winds that swept away all human civilization. The third sun, called 4 Rain, was destroyed by a rain of fire, a detail that should now resonate clearly with everything we examined in part 3 of this documentary. The fourth sun, called 4 Water, was destroyed by a great flood, in which the humans of that age were transformed into fish. Flood, fire, wind, darkness. The specific catastrophe types rotate across the world ages, like the elements of a system cycling through its possible states. And the 5th sun, our current world, is, according to the Aztec tradition, destined to be destroyed by earthquakes. The physical record of these world ages is encoded in what is perhaps the most extraordinary single artifact of the pre-Columbian Americas. The Aztec calendar stone, sometimes called the sunstone, is a circular basalt disc, approximately 3.5 meters in diameter and weighing approximately 24 tons. It was carved sometime around 1427 CE during the reign of the Aztec emperor Axayacatl. and it encodes the entire cosmological framework of the five suns in a single densely layered image. At the center of the stone is the face of Tonatiuh, the sun god, surrounded by four rectangular panels representing the four previous world ages and their respective destructions. Around those panels, a series of concentric rings encode the 20-day signs of the Aztec calendar, the 52-year calendar cycle, and a series of solar and cosmic symbols whose full interpretation continues to generate scholarly debate. Archaeologists have noted that the sunstone was rediscovered on December 17, 1790, during construction work in the Zocalo, the main plaza of Mexico City where it had been buried. Face down in the earth. The face-down orientation is significant. It was not simply abandoned, it was deliberately placed in the ground with its face toward the earth, which some researchers have interpreted as a protective concealment carried out after the Spanish conquest of Mexico in 1521 CE, when the systematic destruction of Aztec sacred objects and manuscripts was being conducted by the colonial authorities. Someone buried it carefully. Someone understood what it contained and wanted it to survive. It survived for 269 years in the ground before a construction crew's tools struck its surface. It is now displayed in the Museo Nacional de Antropología in Mexico City, where it is the most visited single artifact in the museum. Now moved to ancient Greece. In a poem called Works and Days, composed by the poet Hesiod around 700 BCE, the history of humanity is organized into 5 successive races or ages: gold, silver, bronze, heroic, and iron. Each age represents a deterioration from the previous one. The golden race lived in a state of abundance and ease, knowing nothing of labor or suffering. The silver race was less perfect, the bronze race violent and warlike. The heroic race, placed by Hesiod somewhat anomalously between the Bronze and Iron Ages, was the age of the great heroes of Greek mythology, the men who fought at Troy and Thebes. And then came the Iron Age, Hesiod's own time, an age of toil and injustice and the slow forgetting of divine things, which he describes with a weariness that reads as entirely personal. Hesiod does not describe the mechanism by which each age ends, but the structure is clear. A progressive deterioration from a golden origin toward an iron present, with the implication never stated directly, but present in the logic of the sequence that the Iron Age will itself eventually be replaced by something that begins the cycle again. What remains unexplained is why 4 independent cosmological traditions, Vedic India, Aztec Mesoamerica, Ancient Greece, and Norse Scandinavia, with its own cyclical Ragnarok framework, independently arrived at the same fundamental model of time. Not the linear model that dominates the modern Western worldview, in which history moves from a fixed point of creation toward a fixed point of ending and does not repeat, but the cyclical model in which the world has ended before, in which the catastrophe is not an anomaly, but a regular feature of the cosmic schedule, in which the current civilization is not the first and will not be the last. That convergence is not explained by shared cultural contact. The Vedic and Aztec traditions have no documented connection. The Norse and Puranic traditions have no shared linguistic or geographical origin. The Greek and Mesoamerican traditions developed on opposite sides of an ocean that was not crossed in the documented historical record until 1492 CE, and yet all 4 traditions, independently, looked at the history of the world and concluded that it moved in cycles. That catastrophe was not exceptional, but periodic, that the current world stood at a specific point within a larger sequence, and that the sequence would continue past the current world's end. One theory suggests that this convergence reflects not philosophical coincidence, but a shared empirical observation, that the civilizations which developed the world age concept had access, through their preserved catastrophe traditions, to evidence of multiple previous destruction events, evidence sufficient to suggest not a single catastrophe, but a pattern, not a random accident, but a cycle, not an ending, but a transition. The Younger Dryas event at 12,900 years ago, the 535 CE environmental catastrophe, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, which ended or severely disrupted virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously, and whose precise cause remains debated. The 4.2 kiloyear event around 2200 BCE, a prolonged drought that contributed to the collapse of the Akkadian Empire, the Egyptian Old Kingdom, and the Indus Valley Civilization within roughly the same century. The evidence of multiple large-scale catastrophic disruptions within the span of recorded and semi-recorded human history is not theoretical. It is in the geological and archaeological record. It happened more than once. What the World Age traditions may be encoding is the recognition that it happened more than once. That a civilization capable of looking back far enough with traditions precise enough, memory-keeping institutions rigorous enough, astronomical records long enough, could see not just one catastrophe in the past but several, could see them spaced across time in a way that implied regularity rather than randomness, could see, in the accumulated evidence of the past, the outline of a cycle, and having seen that cycle, could understand something that our own civilization, with all of its technology and all of its data, is only beginning to formally reckon with, that the geological record is not the record of a stable planet, occasionally interrupted by disasters. It is the record of a dynamic, violent, periodically catastrophic system within which civilization is not the norm, but the exception, a brief flowering between extinctions, a window of stability that opens and closes on a schedule that the ancient world encoded in myth, precisely because the people who built those traditions understood, in the bones of their cosmological thinking, that the window would eventually close again. The Aztec who carved the sunstone knew they were living inside the fifth Sunday. They knew the fifth sun would end. They carved the mechanism of that ending earthquakes, the glyph for movement into the center of the most important sacred object in their civilization, and then, when the conquest came, buried it face down in the earth so that whoever came after would find it and understand. Someone buried the knowledge. Someone always buries the knowledge, in stone or in story or in the ground, against the day when the window opens again, and someone new needs to remember what the previous world knew. We are the someone new, and the window, the geological record suggests, does not stay open indefinitely, which is exactly the question this documentary has been building towards since the first frame. Not what happened in the past, but what the past is trying to tell us about right now. That is where we are going in the final parts of this story. We have spent 10 parts of this documentary accumulating evidence, moving carefully from the flood traditions to the fire from the sky, from the years without sun to the civilizing strangers, from the geological boundary layer to the monument that should not exist, from the institutional resistance to the world-age cycles encoded in stone and sacred text across every inhabited continent. We have tried, at every step, to anchor the strange in the verifiable, to let the data speak before the interpretation arrives. Now it is time to sit with the interpretations. All of them, including the ones that are uncomfortable in different directions, because there are 3 serious explanations for what we have been examining. 3 frameworks that researchers, philosophers, psychologists, and scientists have proposed to account for the global convergence of catastrophe traditions. Each of them has genuine explanatory power. Each of them has genuine weaknesses. And the honest position, the position that the evidence actually supports, is not that one of them is correct and the others are wrong. It is that each of them explains part of the picture. None of them explains all of it. And the gap between what each explanation covers and what it leaves untouched is precisely where the most interesting questions live. The first explanation is the oldest, and in some ways the most elegant. Call it the psychological universalism framework. It derives most directly from the work of 2 thinkers whose influence on how the 20th century understood mythology was enormous: the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung and the American mythologist Joseph Campbell. The core argument is this: human beings share a common cognitive architecture. We are all born with the same basic neural structures, the same emotional repertoire, the same deep psychological needs and fears. And because we share that architecture, we independently generate the same symbolic structures to process our shared experience. The flood is a universal image of overwhelm, dissolution, the destruction of the known world, and the emergence of something new from the wreckage. The fire from the sky is a universal image of sudden, incomprehensible destruction from a source beyond human control. The darkness is a universal image of depression, of the withdrawal of meaning, of the long night before renewal. The civilizing stranger is a universal projection of the archetype. Jung called the wise old man the figure of knowledge and guidance that appears in the psyche whenever a culture is processing a transition from one state of being to another. On this reading, the convergence of catastrophe traditions across cultures is not evidence of a shared historical event. It is evidence of a shared human psychology. 217 flood traditions do not point to one flood. They point to one mind, the human mind, generating the same story from the same deep materials, because the story serves a universal psychological function. That explanation is genuinely powerful. It is supported by a substantial body of cross-cultural psychological research. The structural parallels that Joseph Campbell documented in his 1949 work, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, are real. The deep grammar of myth does appear to be consistent across cultures in ways that suggest cognitive universals rather than historical diffusion. But the explanation has a weakness that becomes more acute the more closely you examine the specific details of the traditions we have been examining. A universal psychological archetype does not generate identical narrative sequences. The flood archetype, the psychological image of overwhelming dissolution, does not by itself produce the specific detail of a bird released and returned, followed by a second bird released and not returned, as a narrative mechanism for detecting the end of the catastrophe. That level of procedural specificity is not the product of a universal psychological template. It is the product of a specific experience, or a specific transmitted account of a specific experience, replicated across traditions with a precision that the psychological explanation cannot fully account for. The second explanation is diffusionism. The argument, stated plainly, is that one original catastrophe generated one original story, and that story spread along trade routes, along migration corridors, through cultural contact that the historical record has not yet fully documented. The Gilgamesh flood tablet and the Genesis account are not independently generated parallels. They share a common source, an earlier Mesopotamian tradition, from which both drew, and the structural precision of their shared details reflects that common source rather than independent invention. Diffusionism has the advantage of explaining the most precise structural parallels cleanly. The bird release sequence in Gilgamesh and Genesis is not a mystery on this model. It is simply the same story, told twice by cultures that were in closer contact than their claimed independence suggests. The ancient Near East was a region of dense cultural interchange, and the idea that narrative traditions crossed the boundaries between Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Israelite culture is not remotely controversial. But diffusionism has its own weakness, and it is geographical. The Mesoamerican traditions, the Aboriginal Australian traditions, the Norse traditions, these are not the product of Near Eastern cultural diffusion. The distances are too large, the contact too limited, the parallels too structurally precise to be explained by the kind of gradual narrative drift that long-distance diffusion produces. A story that travels 10,000 kilometers through multiple layers of cultural translation does not arrive at its destination with the specific procedural details intact. It arrives as a general shape, not a specific sequence. And what we find in the global catastrophe traditions is not general shapes. It is specific sequences, specific physical details, specific structural elements that survive across the distances and the centuries in ways that diffusionism, taken alone, cannot adequately explain. The third explanation is the one that the geological and geomythological evidence most directly supports, and the one that mainstream academia has been slowest to fully embrace. Call it real catastrophism, or in the more formal academic language, geomythology. The argument is that the myths encode real events, that multiple large-scale catastrophic episodes, the Younger Dryas impact, or impacts at approximately 12,900 years ago, the 4.2 kiloyear drought event around 2200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, the 535 CE atmospheric catastrophe generated real memories in the populations that survived them, and that those memories were transmitted forward through the oral tradition mechanisms we examined in Part 6, preserved with sufficient fidelity to remain recognizable across timescales of thousands, and in some cases, tens of thousands of years. On this model, the flood traditions do not require a single global flood. They require multiple real flood events, the post-glacial sea level rise that inundated coastal settlements across the world over several thousand years, the sudden drainage events from glacial lakes that sent walls of water across inhabited landscapes, the tsunami events generated by submarine landslides and seismic activity along every tectonically active coastline on the planet. All of those events happened. All of them would have generated catastrophe memories in the populations that experienced them, and the structural similarities between the traditions those memories produced reflect not a single event, but a common experience. The experience of water overwhelming the known world, preserved in parallel by cultures that independently coded their own version of the same category of disaster. That explanation is the most empirically grounded of the three. It is supported by the most physical evidence. But it has a weakness too. It does not fully explain the degree of structural specificity shared across traditions from cultures that experience different local events. If 217 separate flood traditions each encode a separate local flood, the structural similarities between those traditions should be general and thematic, not specific and procedural. The bird release sequence should not appear in both Mesopotamia and the Pacific Northwest. The bearded stranger arriving from the sea should not appear in both ancient Babylonia and pre-Columbian Peru. The three-winter darkness should not appear in both Scandinavia and Zoroastrian Iran. Separate local events produce separate local stories. The level of cross-cultural structural precision we observe implies something more than parallel, independent encoding of similar local experiences, which is why one theory suggests a fourth possibility that draws on elements of all three explanations without being reducible to any of them. A single, large-scale event, the Younger Dryas boundary catastrophe, at approximately 12,900 years ago, was large enough and global enough to generate a genuine shared memory across every human population that survived it. That shared memory was then independently elaborated by each surviving culture into its own cosmological and mythological framework, producing the surface diversity of the traditions we observe while preserving the structural core of the original event. The psychological universalism framework explains why the elaborations took the symbolic forms they did. The diffusionism framework explains the closest structural parallels in geographically proximate cultures. The geomythological framework explains the physical accuracy of the environmental details. And the original event, the thing that seeded all three processes simultaneously, was real, was global, and was large enough to leave its signature in the sediment of 50 archaeological sites across 4 continents. That hybrid model is not proven. It is not accepted by the mainstream of any of the disciplines whose evidence it draws on. It sits at the intersection of geology, archaeology, mythology, and cognitive science, and the academic structure of those disciplines organized into separate departments, separate journals, separate professional conferences makes the kind of integrative synthesis the hybrid model requires genuinely difficult to pursue within the normal channels of academic research. What remains unexplained is not any single element of the picture. Each individual piece, the geological boundary layer, the oral tradition fidelity data, the structural mythological parallels, the institutional resistance has been examined and documented by credentialed researchers working within their respective fields. What remains unexplained is the whole, the assembled picture, the thing you see when you step back far enough to take in all the evidence simultaneously rather than examining each piece in the isolation that academic specialization imposes. No single explanation is sufficient. Each one illuminates part of the picture and leaves the rest in shadow. And the shadow, the part that none of the three explanations fully reaches, is exactly the shape of the question that has been waiting at the center of this documentary since the very first frame. Not what happened, but what it means that we are still, after all of this evidence, unable to say with certainty what happened. That uncertainty is not a failure of the inquiry. It is the most honest thing the inquiry has produced. And honesty, when the question is this large, is the only foundation worth building on. The last part of this story is not about the past. It is about right now, about what the past is trying to tell us. Come back to the beginning for a moment. A clay tablet in a museum in London. A shepherd's hand brushing soil from a limestone pillar in southeastern Turkey. A satellite image revealing a dried riverbed beneath the surface of a desert that scholars had insisted for a century contained nothing. a boundary layer in the sediment of a Syrian archaeological site where platinum does not belong but is undeniably present. 217 flood traditions carried forward through the dark by people whose names no living person knows, in languages that no living person speaks, across a distance of time so vast that the word ancient does not come close to capturing it. We started with a question. Why does every ancient civilization describe the same apocalypse? And we have spent 11 parts of this documentary following that question carefully, anchoring it in physical evidence and named researchers and specific sites and peer-reviewed publications, resisting the pull toward the dramatic conclusion and the easy answer. We have tried to hold the question open rather than force it shut. So let us hold it open one more time and ask what it actually means. Not for the ancient world. For this one, the first thing the evidence establishes, beyond any reasonable dispute, is that the pattern is real. Whatever its ultimate explanation, psychological universalism, diffusion, geomythology, or some hybrid of all three, that we have not yet fully articulated the convergence of catastrophe. Traditions across unconnected civilizations is not a coincidence that explains itself. It is a signal distributed across 217 separate traditions, encoded in the sediment of 50 archaeological sites, preserved in the carved surfaces of monuments that should not exist at the dates they were built, carried forward through 10,000 years of careful human transmission by memory keepers whose entire social function was to ensure that what they held would not be lost. Something happened, something large enough that every human civilization that survived it felt compelled to place the memory of it at the absolute center of its cosmological identity. Not at the margins, not in a footnote, at the center. The catastrophe is not decoration in these traditions. It is the foundation, the organizing event around which everything else is arranged. The moment that divides the world that was from the world that is. That level of cultural centrality does not come from a story someone invented. It comes from an experience so overwhelming, so civilization-ending, so permanently reordering of the human relationship with the natural world, that no subsequent generation could afford to forget it. The memory keepers did not preserve the catastrophe traditions because they were interesting. They preserved them because they understood, at some deep institutional level, that forgetting them was a form of civilizational suicide. Which brings us to the second thing the evidence establishes. It has not been resolved by the passage of time, or the development of technology, or the construction of cities and satellites and early warning systems. The geological record is not a record of a planet that used to be dangerous and is now safe. It is the record of a planet that is dangerous on timescales longer than any single civilization has yet survived, and that has demonstrated, repeatedly and without exception, its capacity to reset the conditions of human existence without warning and without mercy. The SpaceGuard survey, operated by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena, California, tracks near-Earth objects, asteroids and comets, whose orbital paths bring them close enough to our planet to constitute a potential impact risk. As of 2023, the survey has catalogued more than 2,000 potential hazards above 140 meters in diameter. The European Space Agency's Hera mission, launched in October of 2024, is traveling to the asteroid Dimorphos to study the results of the DART spacecraft's kinetic impact test from 2022, the first deliberate attempt in human history to alter the trajectory of a celestial body. Planetary defense is no longer science fiction. It is a funded, active, internationally coordinated scientific program, which means that the people whose professional responsibility is to understand the risk have concluded that the risk is real enough to dedicate significant resources to addressing it. The volcanic winter risk is similarly documented and similarly unresolved. The eruption of a Yellowstone-scale supervolcano, the Yellowstone caldera in Wyoming, has erupted 3 times in the last 2,100,000 years. Most recently, approximately 630,000 years ago, would inject sufficient particulate matter into the upper atmosphere to reduce global temperatures by several degrees for years, disrupting agricultural production across the entire northern hemisphere. The 535 CE event, which Mike Bailey's tree ring data and the GISP2 ice core record confirm as one of the worst environmental downturns of the last 2,000 years, was almost certainly the product of a volcanic episode far smaller than Yellowstone's documented eruption history. The Norse tradition encoded the memory of that kind of event as Fimbulwinter. We have the same event in our geological record. We have not yet decided, as a civilization, what to do with that information. The third thing the evidence asks us to consider is perhaps the most quietly unsettling of the three. It is the question of what we are losing right now, in real time, as the traditional knowledge systems that carried these catastrophe memories through 10,000 years of human history are extinguished, one by the same forces of modernization and cultural homogenization that have transformed the surface of the planet in the last 2 centuries. Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reed's research demonstrated that Aboriginal Australian oral traditions accurately preserved geographical information across 12,000 years. That preservation was possible because of specific social structures, specialized memory-keeping roles, ritualized transmission practices, community enforcement of narrative accuracy that took thousands of years to develop and are being lost in decades. The information those traditions contain about sea level change, about coastal geography, about the behavior of the natural world across timescales, no written record approaches that information is not being transferred to any other medium at the rate at which the traditions themselves are disappearing. It is simply being lost, faded into silence. The way the civilizations we have been examining throughout this documentary faded, except that those civilizations left their memories in stone and story, and we are leaving ours in formats that require functioning electricity and stable institutions to access. There is an irony in that. A civilization that can sequence the human genome and land a rover on Mars is losing knowledge that hunter-gatherers preserved across 12,000 years, because the social technologies required to preserve that knowledge, the oral tradition structures, the memory-keeping institutions, the ritualized transmission practices, are incompatible with the pace and structure of modern life, and no one has yet built an adequate replacement. What remains unexplained as we reach the end of this documentary is not the ancient question. The ancient question why every civilization described the same apocalypse has been examined from every angle the available evidence permits. And while no single answer is complete, the shape of the answer is visible. Something happened. It was large. It was global. It was catastrophic enough to organize the entire cosmological thinking of every surviving civilization around its memory. And it happened more than once, which is why the surviving civilizations encoded not a singular apocalypse, but a cycle. That much is clear enough. What remains unexplained is the modern question. The question that the ancient evidence, taken seriously, forces onto the table of the present moment, which is this. If the people who survived the last catastrophe understood their situation clearly enough to build Göbekli Tepe, to carve the sunstone, to develop the transmission practices that carried accurate environmental memory across 12,000 years, to encode the cycle of world ages into the foundational cosmology of every major civilization on the planet, if they understood all of that, and still the knowledge was nearly lost, still the memory faded to the edge of legibility, still we are only now, with satellite imagery and ice cores and nanodiamond analysis and geomythological research, beginning to recover what they were trying to tell us. What are we doing right now to ensure that the knowledge we have built does not suffer the same fate? What are we encoding in forms durable enough to survive what the geological record says is coming, for the people who will sit in whatever remains of our civilization and try to understand what we knew and what we failed to act on? The ancient memory keepers understood something that we are slow to absorb. That knowledge is not permanent by default. That civilization is not a ratchet that only moves forward. That the long work of understanding the world can be interrupted, compressed, nearly erased, and that the only protection against that erasure is the deliberate, sustained, institutionalized commitment to carrying what you know forward in stone, in the bones of your cosmology, in whatever medium survives the next boundary layer. They buried the sunstone face down in the earth so that someone would find it. They carved the vulture stone at Göbekli Tepe and then filled the enclosure with rubble to protect it. They built oral transmission systems rigorous enough to preserve geographical information across 12,000 years of unbroken human nights. They were trying to tell us something. They have been trying to tell us something for a very long time. The only question that remains, the only question that has ever really mattered in this documentary, is whether we are paying attention. And that is where this story ends. For now, because the excavations continue, the ice cores are still being drilled, the boundary layer is still giving up its secrets. One careful field season at a time, the oral traditions that survive are still being documented by researchers who understand what is at stake if they are lost. The question is still open. The evidence is still accumulating, and somewhere beneath the ordinary surface of the world, in a hill in southeastern Turkey, or a submerged coastline off southern Australia, or a sediment core pulled from the floor of the Pacific Ocean, the next piece of the answer is waiting in the ancient silence, patient and undisturbed, for the moment when someone finally looks in exactly the right place. Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the end. If it has opened something in the way you think about the past and what the past is asking of the present, consider sharing it with someone who asks the same kind of questions you do. We will be back with the next part of this larger investigation. Until then, keep looking, keep asking. The questions that do not resolve easily are always the ones most worth carrying.